Hi, everyone. My name is Matt Minnick. I'm a PhD student at UW-Madison, presenting this poster, Does Social Feedback Valence Change the Processes Associated with Conformity? This is a piece of experimental research using functional magnetic resonance imaging. The question we're interested in is basically, how does the valence of social feedback affect those processes we use when we change our attitudes to align with descriptive social norms, with the attitudes of others as we understand them? And that conformity is not unstudied, and it's not unstudied with fMRI. For that reason, there are some pretty well-established patterns of neural activation that are associated with that conformity. And there's a pretty good sense of what cognitive and affective processes are signified by those patterns of activation. There's also some behavioral research that suggests that that conformity is more pronounced in a downward direction than an upward direction. And we're sort of hoping to bridge those two things with this study. So we're trying to understand, how does the valence of social feedback, whether people think something is more valuable or less valuable than we think it is, how does that affect not just the probability of conformity behavior, but also the neural processes associated with that conformity? Our sample was 78 male participants aged 16 to 17. This is a really interesting population to study social influence on, because they place a lot of salience on social relationships. All adolescents do, and they're susceptible for their susceptibility to social influence puts them at risk for a lot of dangerous health behaviors, dangerous driving, smoking, alcohol use, risky sex behaviors, stuff like that. It's also a population that a lot of health communicators are often targeting, and that health communicators often use social influence strategies to try and influence this group. So better understanding how social influence plays out among adolescents, it can be helpful for a lot of different reasons. Our task will be familiar to anybody who has used fMRI to study conformity. First, we had participants rate a number of stimuli before they went in the scanner. We had them rate 80 iPhone apps. We gave them this description: a thumbnail, image, a title, and a very short description. Asked them on a scale of 1 to 5 how likely they'd be to recommend that app to a friend. Then in the scanner, we reminded them of their rating. Then we showed them an experimentally manipulated group rating. They were told this was the average rating of the other teens in the study. It was either aligned with theirs, lower than theirs, or greater than theirs. And then we gave them the opportunity to change their rating to lock in a final rating that would be remembered and recorded at the end of the study. This is, like I said, this is a task that's often used in these sorts of studies, and because of that, there's certain patterns of activation that are consistently associated with it. One is a couple of brain regions that are considered mentalizing regions of interest. Those are the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex and the right temporoparietal junction, and we often see activation in these regions at that moment when people recognize they're out of alignment with the group, when they get that peer feedback that doesn't align with their rating. At that same moment, that moment of recognizing misalignment, we often see activation in the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex and the anterior insula. These are both regions associated with error detection and social pain. And in the moment of conformity, when participants are actually adjusting their attitudes to align with the group, we often see activation in the ventral striatum and the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, which are associated both with valuation and sometimes with reward. Our results aligned with our expectations here in a lot of ways. One was just our behavioral result. We definitely did see that conformity was more likely when participants were presented with lower feedback than theirs than when they were presented with higher feedback. And we did see, in response to that misalignment, we did see that activation of the mentalizing regions appeared to be moderated by the valence of the feedback, such that when participants found they were misaligned in such a way that they had rated something higher than the group, we saw more activation in these regions than when they realized they had rated something lower than the group. Similarly, when participants were adjusting their reported attitudes to align with the group, we saw that the level of activation in the ventral striatum and ventral medial prefrontal cortex was moderated by valence as well, in such a way that it was greater when participants were adjusting their attitudes downward. We also did some whole brain analyses. This is comparing all instances of downward adjustment with all instances of upward adjustment. This is what's depicted here is increased activation in the downward adjustment condition, and it's not immediately clear from the image. but that's what we're seeing here. And you can see there's a lot of different areas that are differentially associated with downward adjustment. And what's really interesting is we have a bunch of them in sort of this frontal region here. We have some idea of what that might mean proposed in the paper. We also adjusted conformity downward with misalignment that didn't result in conformity, times when participants stuck to their guns. And what we saw is in the downward adjustment condition, we saw the real difference in activation there is in the ventral striatum, right, which is what we would have expected from the literature. What's interesting is we didn't see this pattern when we compared upward adjustment with upward misalignment without adjustment. We didn't see any significant pattern of activity there. Our conclusions, basically, to summarize very briefly, because I know I'm out of time, is that social feedback valence matters, and that this is something that's important to consider both when we're designing interventions that are designed around the power of social influence for teens, but also when we're studying social influence and conformity in this population. We're trying to explain variance. It's important to consider the valence of that social influence, and it often is not. If you have any questions about this, please contact me. My name's Matt Minnick. It's MMINICH@wisc.edu. Thanks for watching this whole thing. Enjoy the rest of the conference. And I hope to see everybody in person for the first time next year. Thanks.